start by looking at the atrial and ventricular pressures during the various phases. So during phase 1, what phase is phase 1? What's happening in phase 1? What's happening in phase 1? Are we filling or are we emptying? We're filling, right? We just begun filling. So what are the valves doing at this point? If the ventricles are filling, what valve is open? Semilunar valves or AV valves? If the ventricle is filling, right, blood goes from atria to ventricle, which of the two valves will be open? The AV valve, perfect, the AV valve. So we start out with filling into the ventricle because the AV valve is open. And please remember that means that the atrial pressure exceeds the ventricular pressure during this phase. So the ventricular pressure is low, atrial pressure is higher, blood is spilling from the atria down into the ventricle, and we have a small rise in the ventricular pressure at the end, which I mentioned this small bump here is because the atria towards the end of that first phase, they're contracting just a little to get that last bit of blood out. So the atria don't start to contract until the very end of phase 1, okay? And it's sort of a last ditch effort to get that very last bit of blood out of the atria. But for the most part, it is a passive process, okay? During phase 2, we have the rapid rise in ventricular pressure. What valves are open during phase 2? This is our isovolumetric ventricular contraction. None, right? None of our valves are open, right? Please make that connection. During phase 2, what we have is that rapid increase. The ventricle has begun squeezing, but it is not creating enough pressure to exceed the pressure in the vessel just yet. But during this phase, the pressure is rapidly rising and the atrial pressure begins to fall, okay? During phase 3, we now have enough pressure. As we can see here, this green line is representing the pressure in the ventricle. And as we can see here, during phase 2, it's rising. And towards phase 3, we have a period where it's high enough to overcome the valve. So we open up what valve? What valve do we open during phase 3? Semilunar valves, perfect. So semilunar valves now open here and blood can move from the ventricle now out into the vessel, depending on what side we are in the heart, either the pulmonary artery or the aorta. So now we have ventricular pressure rising slightly and then falling as that blood actually leaves, okay? And then the atrial pressure falls further until late systole. So this is really insignificant here, what's happening in the atria during phase 3, because we're really focused on ventricular ejection, right? Blood is leaving the ventricle and making its way out of the heart to the vessel. And then in phase 4, we know simply we have isovolumetric relaxation, which is very similar to phase 2, but here the ventricle is contracting, right? Both valves are closed again. The ventricles are contracting, meaning that the pressure in the ventricle is falling until we get back to phase 1. Now I want to point out here which phases are diastole and which phases are systole. So systole starts at phase 2, right? Remember we said systole is that period of contracting, specifically for the ventricles. So systole starts at phase 2, so phase 2 and 3 are systole, whereas phase 4 and 1 are diastole. So during phase 4, we start relaxing, and during phase 1, we finish or end that relaxation period. So phase 2 and 3 are systole, phase 4 and 1 are diastole. Now the heart spends much more time in diastole, right? Why would that be? Why would that be? Why would the heart spend more time filling? Because that's what you really, that's sort of the part of the process that you don't want to compromise, right? If we fill the heart too quickly, what could happen? What could happen in terms of the quantity of blood, in terms of the oxygenation of our tissues? That could be compromised, right? If we don't allow the heart enough time to fill, it won't have enough blood to actually eject. Okay, so ventricular relaxation or diastole is really important, and it's the majority of the cardiac cycle because that's the time that we need the heart to fill adequately in order to eject adequately. We'll talk about the volumes in a little bit. All right, let's look at what's happening in diastole. So in diastole, we know that the aortic valves close. We're looking at what's happening in the aorta at this point. So specifically what's happening on the left side of the heart, and the left side of the heart is usually the more important side of the heart, simply because we're working against the peripheral tissues, right? The lungs, and not the lungs, the heart, the other tissues, our limbs, our other organs. And so the aortic pressure is really representative of what the rest of your body is doing. Okay, the aorta is the vessel that feeds all your other arteries and arterioles and capillaries. And so it's a really good indicator of cardiac health and of vascular health. And so this is where we derive our blood pressure by looking at the pressures that change in this specific vessel, the aorta. So during diastole, the aortic valves close and blood is still leaving the aorta. So the pressure begins to fall here. So we know that this is diastole. Phase 4, leading into phase 1. And what we can see is the pressure falls. Why would the pressure fall during diastole? What's happening in the aorta? So think about the aorta respective to diastole. So blood is leaving the aorta, right? Blood is leaving the aorta and it's going out to all the peripheral tissues. And so the pressure falls, right? The pressure drops, and the lowest point of the pressure, right? This is called our diastolic pressure, whereas the highest point of the pressure, this is called our systolic pressure, okay? Oh, there we go. So diastole is going to be the emptying of this chamber, the emptying of the heart, of the vessel here, right? Not the ventricle, right? We're not speaking about the ventricle here. We're speaking about that vessel, that aorta. And so diastole is going to be emptying of that, and that's where the pressure is going to go to its lowest. All that blood is leaving the vessel and going out to the tissues. Whereas systole, we have this valve open. The aortic valve is open. Remember, it's one of our semilunar valves. The ventricles are actively contracting. They're ejecting blood. And so we have a really high pressure here during systole. Again, we're referencing the aorta when we speak about aortic pressures. Okay, so in systole, we have the highest pressure, right? That's because the valve is open. In diastole, we have the lowest pressure. That's because the valves are closed. All the blood is leaving and going up to the tissues. And so this is where we get our diastolic and systolic pressures from in terms of our blood pressure, right? Systolic is going to be our top number. What's the highest pressure in our aorta? Diastolic blood pressure is going to be our bottom number. What's the lowest pressure after all the blood has moved out into the peripheral tissues? And so that's a really good ratio to not only look at what the cardiac function looks like, but again, what the vessels look like. If your vessels are full of plaque or are narrowed for whatever reason, this is going to be really indicative in terms of your blood pressure. Your diastole is going to be really high because now your pressure in your aorta never fully drops to as low as it should, because it's going against the resistance of those narrowed arteries, narrowed vessels. And so we have a high diastolic pressure, but then we also have a high systolic pressure too. And that's because the ventricle has to work even harder to overcome those narrowed vessels, okay? So this is how blood pressure comes into play and how it tells us a little bit about cardiac function, but also vascular function, okay? All right, let's look at the mean arterial pressure here. This is an average between our aortic pressure during the phase of the cardiac cycle. So the mean arterial pressure is really an average between your systolic and your diastolic pressure. So what does your average pressure in that vessel looks like? This is also another important indicator of cardiovascular function, okay? People who have heart failure usually have a very poor mean arterial pressure. Continuous blood flow through the cardiac cycle. This is what we really want to ensure when we talk about movement of blood through the aorta. And this just means that the cardiac cycle has a period where valves are opened and valves are closed. But we know that we cannot have a period where our body is not getting blood. So we must maintain a continuous blood flow even through the phases of the cycle where valves are closed. And I'll talk about how that's brought about. But the important part of that is understanding the nature or the anatomy, the makeup of the aorta. It's an elastic artery, right? It's one of the most elastic arteries in the body. And so it can act as a pressure reservoir to help maintain the pressure after that valve has closed, okay? So basically it stores some energy during systole. So when the ventricle is squeezing blood out, it's going to capture some of that energy. And then during diastole, it's going to sort of recoil on itself to squeeze that blood along. And that is what maintains continuous circulation, continuous perfusion through all phases of the cycle. Okay, let's look at this illustration. So during systole, again, we're reminding ourselves here, this is phase 2 and phase 3. This is isovolumetric ventricular contraction along with ventricular ejection. So here we have blood leaving the ventricle. Remember, the ventricle is preceding the aorta. So blood is leaving the ventricle, making its way out to the aorta, and we have a nice even flow here. But during this time, the aorta, this very elastic artery, kind of stretches out and captures some of that energy, okay? During diastole, the valve closes, right? The semilunar valves close, including the aortic valve, and so we don't have flow. Flow is interrupted here. But the recoil of this elastic artery, which you can see here, is what continues to push that blood along as if the heart were actually pumping it out. So this is the mechanism of this elastic artery to maintain continuous perfusion through all phases of the cardiac cycle, whether the valve is opened or closed. Okay, we can see flow remains the very same, simply because that recoil, that elasticity of the artery sort of pushes the blood along in the phase where we don't have the valve open. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Okay, let's talk about the volumes a little bit here, the ventricular volumes. So there are three main volumes, and these are the end diastolic volume, the end systolic volume, and the stroke volume. Okay, now don't get psyched out about these terms. Just think about what they are actually saying. So end diastolic volume is the volume that is in the ventricle at the end of diastole. Okay, very simple, very straightforward. So after the heart has filled and those two valves close, we are in a period of isovolumetric contraction, and the volume is not changing. And so the amount of blood that we filled into that ventricle is our end diastolic volume. When would we capture that? Which phase of the cardiac cycle would we capture that? When would we capture end diastolic volume? Well, we know it's the end of diastole, right? So what phase is that? Phase one, right? So at the end of phase one, or during phase two, because the volume is the same during phase two, we can capture the end diastolic volume, the total amount of blood that was filled into the ventricle. And the systolic volume is captured at the end of systole. And we know that systole is ventricular ejection, after blood is being squeezed out of the ventricle. And so this is basically how much blood is left back in the ventricle after ejection, okay? And as we can see here, all of the blood does not leave the ventricle. We must reserve some of the blood in the chamber in order to continue. I'll talk about this next week in cardiac output, but the heart has this nature where it has to be filled with some amount of blood to maintain its contractility. And so all of the blood never actually leaves the ventricle. And so after the systole, after the ejection, whatever is left in the ventricle, that's our end systolic volume. Stroke volume, consequently, is the difference between that, right? The end diastolic is how much we filled to begin with in that ventricle. The end systolic is how much we have left after ejection. And if we minus how much we filled, if you minus how much is left from how much we filled, we get our stroke volume. This is how much actually left the heart. All right, so end diastolic is how much we fill to begin with. End systolic is how much we've got left after we eject. And systolic is basically, our stroke volume rather, is basically how much blood was actually ejected from the heart, okay? And as you can see here, in typical numbers look like 130 for our end diastolic volume, 60 for our end systolic volume, that's how much is left in the heart. And then our stroke volumes are 70 milliliters. That's how much is actually moved out of the heart into our peripheral tissues.